Disorder having broken out.
Welcome everybody. Hi, and welcome to another edition of Praxis TV. And I've got with me today Jon Trickett MP, who everybody on the left knows and doesn't really require an awful lot of introduction, but I'm delighted that you've agreed to join me today, Jon. Thanks very much for coming on the show.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be, I'm excited and I admire what you're doing. And we just need to build audiences for our media, don't we? Rather than relying on the official media, which never tell the complete truth.
Oh, it's dire. Yeah, we do. That's exactly what we need to do. So I'll ask you the first question that I ask everybody to just kick us off with our discussion. And that question is, are you working class?
Well, good question. I think it's very hard for MPs to say that they're working class anymore. So I'm not gonna say that. But my background is that, and I became an MP when I was 46 years old. I think up to then I'd never earned the average wage even, and I was for a lot of that time a manual worker, working on building sites. And though there was a time when I went off to university, I studied at college, went to university. But in the meantime, I had 2 kids and the money ran out, so I had to go back to work. So university was a great time, but I went back to work. So I come from from a working class background. We lived in a house that was condemned as a slum and was demolished in due course. And we went through the usual stuff. I was expelled from school. Well, I won't say expelled. I will say I was politely requested that I don't come back from school when I was, actually it was Easter when I was 15 years old. Actually, you should have, by law, stayed until you were 16, but the head, I think, was quite glad to see the back of me. So that's a little bit about my background. I worked on building sites and I enjoyed every minute of it. I loved working with, friends and, comrades, you might call them. There were quite interesting days. I was there when the building workers strike that they're talking about now because of Shrewsbury, 1972, I think it was. I was there when the bricklayers particularly seemed to, I don't want to say this, but they often seem to be quite right-wing. And there was a campaign, keep politics out of sport, blood sports. A lot of them had those posters in the back of the vans when they were going to work. So we had some interesting conversations, but probably conversation is an understated word for what goes on building sites, as you might imagine. But yeah, I did all that. And then eventually I went off and somehow or another, I don't know how it happened, got myself elected onto Leeds City Council. And that was the start of a political phase of my life. It was actually in the middle of the miners' strike. I spent half the miners' strike trying to get elected, and the other half of the miners' strike, I did quite a lot of fixing, striking miners, plumbing and heating and that kind of stuff, because they couldn't afford to, there were people with families, and if the heating wasn't working or the plumbing, the bath wouldn't run, they couldn't pay for it, and I used to go around and do a bit of that. So yeah.
Wow,
interesting times.
That is really interesting. There's so much that you've said there that I could go off. I'm just trying to think where to start. In terms of sort of building sites and things, I mean, I knew sort of working class lads in the 80s around about, the teenage years sort of thing, who did apprenticeships in, joinery or whatever else. There was a very strong sort of macho culture and initiation rites and all sorts of things that went on. It was quite difficult, wasn't it, as a young lad, young working class lad?
I mean, it was actually.
Yeah, tough.
Hilarious stories, which I better not say because they're not polite. When I was 16, I went to work off with my granddad was a plumber. My dad was in the similar trade. He was a heating engineer, worked with steam. My dad had learned about steam on boats in the war as a merchant navy, and steam is a very powerful driver of engines, but it's also very, very dangerous because steam occupies something like 10 times the volume of water. So as water flashes into steam, it suddenly expands massively, and you have to be very, very careful, otherwise it's explosive. Well, in Leeds, where I grew up, the clothing factories all had steam because they had steam presses, to press the trousers, the skirts or the jackets or whatever. And that was quite a specialist job. So I worked for a time doing that. With my granddad, a bit with my dad in the clothing factories. And I often say that I was quite privileged, though it's not a privilege to be an old man like I am now, but in a way to have been there at the end of the industrial age. Because clearly it wasn't clear that the factory system was about to disappear from large parts of Britain. But it wasn't clear. I mean, when I was going there, the factories were at full flood. You know, the clothing factories particularly were full of women. And there was a gender differentiation a little bit. The men would do the cutting, cut the cloth, but then the women would do the bulk of the work. And yeah, I mean, a factory full of 9,000 women as a 16-year-old lad. I don't know whether it sounds like a great honeypot or something to be frightened of, but I can tell you I was quite frightened of it. Those women were very, very powerful women, I can tell you. And,
yeah.
More than once I was put in a very embarrassing situation, but we're not going to discuss that. But yeah, I mean, so the end of the factory period. So I was born in 1950. So you can see I was 66 in 1966, 67, on and off through that period. And then as the factories closed, I got more into working on building sites and building houses and flats. And then later on, I found I was quite skillful at doing, you know, tackling building problems, one kind or another. So I did quite a lot of that. And, you know, working on your own, on the lump or self-employed was good. I even in them days, a long time ago now, I thought there weren't any women working on building sites, the point you've made. And I did have a number of people, women, who I encouraged to come and work with me, and they learnt trades with me. And some of them have gone on to do great things, you know, as you know, with a manual worker background. So I did all of that, you know, was quite good. I used to have a big red van, and it used to have anti-nuclear stickers all over it. You can imagine it in the 1970s and anti-Vietnam War stuff before. Yeah, it was an interesting life, but I suppose I began to think about my life, what had happened to me when I was 15 and asked not to come back. And that, I think, is a subject which we might get onto, because what happens to working class people in a capitalist system of our kind? I think it does lead you on to think about a number of thoughts and what's the role of the labour movement in relation to all of that injustice which people often face.
Yeah. It's a complex area, isn't it, class? And it's a thorny topic as well, in a lot of ways, because I think that if you, on the left, you know, within socialism, that's what we're there to do. We're there to sort of fight for equality and fight for social justice. And if within that, we have to admit we have certain privileges, because all of us do, well, most of us do in one way or another, it can become uncomfortable, you know, I think, for people. Similarly to how it might have been difficult initially for people to have those honest conversations about race or about gender. I think with class, somehow or other, because there's no like open discussion around class discrimination really anymore. There used to be. In the 80s, it was quite a common thing to talk about, and it was included in sociology courses to a much greater extent than it is now. And also the studies and the research around how it happens, you know, within school, within the workplace, or within education, higher education, and politics, law, everywhere. This sort of additional layer of discrimination between people that have middle class privilege and people that don't, that used to be acknowledged, and the science behind that used to be analysed, and the working class themselves used to be more aware of it.
Yeah, I think there was a degree of class consciousness.
Yeah.
But although if you were to ask the British people today, do you consider yourself working class or not, the vast majority will say they're working class.
They will, yeah.
And there was a lot of polling to show that that's the case. But of course, how you define working class is actually quite difficult. I mean, I remember reading some stuff written in the 1950s about the way in which what we then called middle class occupations and professions
Yeah.
were becoming proletarianized. That's a very
Yeah.
difficult word to say, but
Yeah.
you would say that a professional job would have characteristics where you were more or less in control of the work process.
Mm-hmm.
You were in command of what happened at work, and you weren't alienated as much
Yeah.
as you were if you were a manual worker doing a crap job on an assembly line or something.
Yeah.
However, it became clear back in the 40s and 50s that professional work itself was changing.
Mm-hmm.
The professions and middle class people had less control over what happened at the workplace, and then were reduced to more menial type, not manual tasks, but menial in the sense of routine, humdrum, repetitive kind of jobs.
Mm.
And it's true, I think, that what in the 1950s you could say was a privileged middle class background in terms of work has changed quite substantially. I'm very interested in that because it partly helps to explain the radicalization of large groups of people during who Corbyn appealed to.
Yeah.
And I think we shouldn't just dismiss them.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, then what traditionally was called working class rather than working people did feel quite neglected, and I think we should have we should talk about that.
It's difficult. I mean, I think there are. I mean, if you look at the statistics, then the working class is still there. If we look, it depends on how you define it, doesn't it? It's like you say, it is a more tricky one because if you're talking about, well, I mean, there are more blurred areas if you're talking about gender, not so much race, not so much disability. But generally, if you're talking about sort of sexism, you know what you're talking about. Whereas when you talk about classism, if you then have to take into account the fact that work has changed for people, within what would traditionally be called the working class and what would traditionally be called the middle class, there is some degree of greater blurring than there was between that boundary. But also then if you throw in the Marxist definition that people often use within the left, which is that you sell your labor, then that includes Boris Johnson. It's like, but we know that there's sort of 97% of MPs are from backgrounds where they haven't done routine, humdrum, repetitive work. So we know there's a huge number of people that used to feel at home within the Labour Party. That's Labour MPs. We know that they're not included anymore. So we have to talk about it, but it's hard to know how to talk about it and get that buy-in when we're not all necessarily using the same language for the same thing anymore. But that layer of discrimination and exclusion, it's still there. It's still there, and it's not just about that 99%. So it's kind of like it's difficult sometimes to know how to tackle it.
Well, here's two things really to what you just said. The first is there's a lot of talk about different forms of oppression depending on your identity. Some of those identities are biological, though this is a complicated debate once you get into trans issues, but so for example, if you've got a certain ethnicity, or if I don't know, you're disabled or something.
Yeah.
So it strikes me all of those groups face forms of oppression which are very difficult and which we need to be on the side of, whether we're one of those people who's oppressed or not. As a woman, clearly, you face patriarchy. And however, I personally hold to the view that the underlying structural problem in a capitalist society is the way in which labor itself is exploited. And the question is, and if that's the underlying issue, now, I want to say something controversial, but I think it's true. But I mean, it would be interesting to get a debate going. The thing is this, Marx and the socialists, all of the socialists through history, said that the way to resolve humanity's problems was for the working class, broadly defined, all working people, to introduce a new kind of society and effectively to abolish capitalism and the capitalist class. And that will be the end of class society once and forever.
Yeah.
I still think that's true, personally. I still think that's true. However, it seems to me it's quite possible to imagine a class of society which has still got patriarchy or racism or whatever forms of oppression. So that can't be ignored, and we can't simply say we're going to resolve all of humanity's problems by the emancipation of the working class, as Marx put it. But I still think that process of exploitation, which we don't talk about as much as we did on the left, is a key to understanding the nature of society. And also, Marx then says, well, it's also about social change. How do you interpret what will happen?
Yeah.
The history of all previous existing societies is a history of class societies, he says. The working class is historic mission. But remember, he's talking about working class in a wider definition than common youth. Will actually resolve that problem, but it won't resolve all the environmental issues and all the other things that go on. So that is something which we've come to understand more. And so clearly on that issue, if you are very narrow definition of Marxism, clearly it wasn't understanding the heterogeneous nature of society.
Yeah.
But I think I want to try to, if we can come shortly to the Labour Party's role in all this. I think it'd be quite interesting for us to discuss.
Yeah. Okay. Just before we move on to that, I just wanted to go back to something that you'd said about that you were politicized when you were when you first started out in a trade, you know, as a young working class man, and that a lot of the people around you were sort of, because we've had this, I think Gramsci would call it hegemony or hegemony. I never know how you say it. But it's this, like, the media pumps out divide and rule sort of messages constantly. You know, working class people are bombarded with them constantly, and you could look at that and think, well, you know, possibly that's not accidental. It seems to serve capitalists pretty well that we're divided as a working class. But, you know, as someone who has a political consciousness around those things and who has sort of you know, socialist leanings from an early age, like, it reminded me of The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist. I've been reading that to my son, because that was a guy there, wasn't it, that was kind of trying to impart some alternative ideas to what the mainstream media was pumping out, an alternative to the, you know, and I think that's just, it's intensified so much over the years. Working class people, though, in the 80s, I can remember a lot of the people on building sites and things like that, there was more socialist awareness even within those spheres, even given that.
There was aware of class. I think there was an awareness of class and how we were being exploited.
Yeah.
I think that has changed, not perhaps as much as the sociologists and the professors and all these wise people who run our society's intellectual reproduction processes would have it. But it's there still, but it needs to be released. Look, what happened to me was my granddad, when I was 15, actually, he said, "I'm right sorry, you had to leave school, John." He says, "I can see you're sad." I said, "Yeah, well, I am sad. I've let my mum and dad down." Then he says, "Actually, you've got to think about this all differently to what you're thinking." He says, "It's designed for people like us to fail." And I didn't know what he meant, but this idea of people like us is lived with me all my life. It was something he said in passing. He wouldn't, he's dead now, obviously, but I mean, he would never remember having said it. But I think this idea, I kept on thinking about people like us. Who are there? And then I thought to myself, well, there were other kids like me at school, and they failed as well, And I thought that the education system isn't really working for people like us, but actually it's a much wider thing than just education. It's about the way in which the economy, politics, society, even religion, and all these different thought systems are all tied together in a system which tries to say that the people who naturally govern are who should be the governors of our country are the upper class people. And my other granddad, he was the right character, but he was he spent a lot of time out of work. He was doing work which was illegal, in terms of, he was a bookie, which you weren't allowed to do that out on the streets collecting money. My mother, when she was a little child, she used to hold the satchel with his money in, he lived a very difficult life. However, he said to me, I was testing various ideas out, as you do when you're a lad. And he used to say, well, Churchill were born to rule. Let them people rule. We're not interested in ruling. We just got to get on with striking, struggle from day to day.
Yeah.
And all of these debates were going on, and they still are. They're still there.
Yeah.
I think the left's got to get back to this issue of class and the nature of capitalism itself. And what I just think, what we've got to remember when we think about all this stuff is the Labour Party was formed really by people who were organised at the place of work in trade unions. And the trade unions were the forerunners of the Labour Party, as we know it. They could see that you could do quite a lot with the industrial struggle. You could perhaps try to get wages raised or get an extra day's holiday, whatever it might be, by strike or by negotiation with the gaffers. But you couldn't get a law passed to stop little boys being sent up chimneys or to change the air that we were breathing because it was polluted. When I lived in Leeds back in the 1950s, the Kirkstall Road in Leeds was one of the most polluted roads in the whole of Europe because there were all these tanneries and things and factories producing fumes. I remember my mother in about 58, I think it was, there was a Clean Air Act, and she was out there fighting for clean air so that you could keep the washing clean on Monday mornings when the washing were done, and little John, his lungs pure, that kind of stuff. But the point about the Labour Party is the Labour Party came into existence because there was a limit to what you could do through class action at the place of work.
Yeah.
And it was impossible to reconcile the interests of working people with the nature of capitalism at that stage of its development. So the Labour Party consisted of various different strands, but all of them, in part, were trying to say, one way or other, either you've got to abolish capitalism or you've got to radically transform it. That goes right through our history until quite recently, when suddenly we decided capitalism was a good thing. And I think that is the point at which we then get into difficulty. So let me just get my idea out, and then if you're interested, we can discuss it. So this is what I think happened. Back in the people who led our party after the war had been formed in the 20s and 30s, mass unemployment, mass deprivation, poor housing and all the rest of it. And they came in and thought, we cannot allow this system after the war to be what it was before the war. So they began to transform it now. And it was a big transformation. It wasn't as far as I would like to go because I'm a socialist, but it was definitely tackling some of the roots of inequality in our society, which affect working class people. By the mid-1950s, there's a shift, and it's done in a famous book by a man called Anthony Crosland, who's a big politician, but he's also a big ideas guy. And he writes a book called The Future of Socialism. What he says, though, is capitalism is perfectly capable of delivering what it is that the Labour's about, which he said is about a more equal society, and it can be done within capitalism. And this is the start of a long process by which sections of the Labour Party say, well, we're going to reconcile ourselves to the capitalist society. By the time you get into the Blair governments, there's an element of, actually before that, but there's an element of saying, well, some of the things which are unfortunate, we can't change, but we can try to mitigate, like an elastoplast on a great big wound. Now, I think that causes a problem because the class which had created us still has the same problems with the way British capitalism works as they did back in the 1890s. They're not the same in detail, but it's big picture problems of housing supply, problems of now food supply, the end of social mobility of any kind, deindustrialization, all of those problems are great, been really quite difficult for working class people and middle class people too. Now, if you, as a Labour Party, say we want workers to vote for us, and we think capitalism is great, I don't think there's loads of workers out there saying, well, capitalism crap. But what they're saying is we want to see a party that changes our conditions, which protects us and improves the position in which we live. If our party doesn't do that, then people will naturally say, well, I'm sorry, you've turned your back on me, I'm not going to turn your back on you. And that is where we now are. And because there was a pause when Jeremy came in, and we were able to say we're going to offer radical change. And I think there's a lot of people do want radical change. But, I started writing about working class disaffection from Labour in 2005 after the Blair victory, because what had become clear is we'd lost about nearly 4 million votes. And when I looked into the detail, it was working class votes. So I wrote some stuff then, and I've written and spoke about the same phenomenon since 2005, nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
And I can't get people to, but the leadership does. It seems to be more committed to the existing economic structures than it does to the very people who they expect to vote for us. That is a problem. Yeah.
So was Labour at any point, when it was first sort of created, was it at any point sort of prepared to, was it always bought into just reforming capitalism?
No, there was always a debate.
Right.
There was always a debate. If you say there was, I don't know, the 4 or 5 components. There were the socialists who clearly thought that we had to move on. There was a split amongst the socialists after the Bolshevik Revolution, as you know, but there was still a large body of socialists in the party. There were social democrats who believed in, huge strides towards equality, a class of society.
Yeah.
They didn't really address whether it could be done within capitalism, but there were quite a lot of that. There were Christian socialists. And then there was the Fabians who might say, well, we're a bit affronted by that because we're social democrats. Actually, the Fabianism, it seems to me, is really from the beginning arguing, almost from the beginning, not quite, for a form of mitigation against the worst effects of capitalism. But the balance between the different groups inside the Labour Party shifted over time. Remember, the thing that made us cohere together more than anything was determination to try to stop the Tories from winning the election.
Yeah.
So what bound us all together, whether they were Marxists or whether they were Christian, socialists, whatever, we all thought the one thing we can agree on is we need to get an elected government which gets rid of the blood of Tories.
Yeah.
So I think there was always going to be compromise. It was always going to be some fudges around the edges. There were moments when the socialists were dominant. I mean, I think Lansbury, one of our leaders, he made lots of mistakes, but he was clearly a transformational person. And also, there was also, I mean, Attlee was a great transformer, though, there were things which you wouldn't really want to agree with. So, look, it came and went. The long-term thing that I'm wrestling with, and the party needs to wrestle with, is look at today's polls this week.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about history, I'm talking about now.
Yeah.
The Tories have got like a 25% or something lead amongst working class voters.
Yeah.
Now, don't blame working people. It's our task to win those votes. They created us. And this red wall debate is a much bigger debate than the geography of the red walls.
Yeah.
And that is where we now are. So it's right up to date is this stuff, but it's like a lifetime of experience of mine, my own personal engagement in working class life, and the fact I represent the working class constituency.
I mean, it's pretty obvious to me, and other people that I've interviewed as well that I've spoken to, working class people who, I mean, Gramsci again talked about working class intellectuals, and that would be sort of the layer of people. So I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing, my guess would be that what he meant by that was people from working class backgrounds who've seen how class discrimination works and excludes and understand about how that whole capitalist system kind of drives that and requires it, relies on it. If you get an insight into that and you're able to articulate it, the sort of social injustice of it, it prevents you from being quiet about it, even though it's an unpopular conversation in some circles, including in some socialist circles. Because a lot of socialists within our party, and I think we have to admit this, are uncomfortable with talking about class and the working class as anything other than the 99% that aren't in that very top layer. And I think the problem with that is it's borne out in the statistics then, because if we've only got, like in 1951, it was 37% of MPs in the Labour Party that were from those manual, routine, low status, humdrum backgrounds, and it's now 3%. And yet upwards of 30% of the population still work in that type of work. That's really stark. And so we have to have that conversation. We have to admit that there has been a squeezing out of actual working class people by the middle class, not deliberately, but just because that's how privilege works. Any type of privilege works like that. The people who've got more power and more confidence and more connections and look like other people that are in charge are favored. It's just human nature. And unless we admit it and do something positive about it, it doesn't change. So, we've had great results with sort of where we had, we've got now 1 in 5, I think, Labour MPs are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. Over half of our MPs are women. And within LGBTQ plus community, we've got an overrepresentation compared to the proportion of people that are LGBT within society, in MPs within the Labour Party. But when you look at class and when you look at disability, those two things, we are way, off the mark with that as a socialist party that's supposed to be there for the working class and that started out as the party of the working class. So it's kind of these difficult conversations about class, I think they have to be had, and it can't just be on the basis of if you sell your labour, then you're working class, because unless you see people in positions of leadership within a socialist party that look and sound like you and share the same life experience and understand the types of discrimination and prejudice that you face, it's not going to be relevant. It's going to become increasingly irrelevant, So I think, like, even with the fantastic socialist policies that we had under Corbyn, that 3% didn't increase. It didn't increase. So that's why I feel it's a critical conversation, for us to be having right now, despite that anytime I try and have it within the Labour Party, I come under the same lines of attack for attempting to have it. So do you have any?
Well, I spent all my life talking about that subject. I mean, I was elected in the middle of the miners' strike, as I said. I went as a councillor, and I went off I became the leader in a very short period of time, actually. But I went off to sign in. I was in my overalls lunchtime, and they won't let me in the building. They say, "You've got to go around the back. That's where the workers go." I said, "I'm a bloody councillor." No, you can't come in here, mate. But I mean, much later, I was a member of the Shadow Eds. I was a front bencher for many years, and I very clearly recall one of my most senior staff was told by somebody who quite senior in the party that I was the last person of my kind who will ever get into the Shadow Cabinet, into a Labour Shadow Cabinet, and I think it's quite important that underrepresented groups, the party makes a massive effort to ensure that they are no longer underrepresented. Now, the party, I think, maybe naturally is focused on certain characteristics which are underrepresented in the wider society.
Yeah.
If you look at class, for example, if you look at people who are state educated, even never mind class, it's quite striking how I think we looked at the last 11 prime ministers. I'm not sure I'm right about this, but I think 7 of them went to one school, and I think every one of them have been to Oxford, barring one or something like that. So I think if you have Labour MPs that talk like they're in an Oxford seminar at PPE doing politics and philosophy and economics on telly or, round and about, that vocabulary, that rhythm of speech, that accent, that way of dressing, the way of your look will convey itself in a particular way. Now, I had this conversation with Gordon Brown shortly after he became Prime Minister, and I ended up working in Downing Street for Gordon, who I like. But they asked to see me, the new Prime Minister asked to see me on the first, I think it was the first or second Wednesday of PMQ, after PMQs. And I said, well, if he's I want to say something to him. Oh no, you've got to tell me. They're sort of saying to me, you've got to tell us what you're going to tell him before we agree. So I said, look, I won't be coming because I'm not telling you what I'm going to speak to a man who's got the same party card as me. It's a conversation between me and him. Anyway, so actually it was on a Wednesday and I was a bit fed up, so I went off for a bike ride and I came back and I got to Parliament about 20 to 1 or something. this is not what MPs usually do, but I'm giving you insight into what I was doing that day. I came in and my staff were going, why haven't you had your phone on? Well, Gordon's sitting there waiting for you. I said, well, I told him I'm not bloody going, because they want me to tell him in advance. So anyway, we decided I should go. So sorry, this is a long story, but so we get into there's a big ministerial suite behind the speaker's chair, and go in there, and come in now, John, you're late. So dash in. There's Gordon, and there's it's an L-shaped room. There's a big cabinet table, and then in the L-shape, there's 2 settees and an armchair. The settees are facing each other. So I thought to myself, I'm going to get my bum on my settee before he gets his on it. So I got down as fast as I could. Gordon, we've got to do something about the PLP. There's too many people from a certain background, and people, I said, if the wind changes direction in Fife, even though you haven't been there for 3 weeks, the political or the cultural or the economic wind, it because you were born there. You go, yeah, that's true, John. I said, if something happens in Yorkshire, something's going on. I said, I know it, and I don't even have to be there. And I said, the problem is, that we got the balance wrong. Oh, he says you're against people who are clever coming into Parliament as Labour MPs. No, I'm not. I said, but they're not so keen on people like us coming in. And besides which, what you're saying is, are you saying that only clever people in the country are gone to Oxford?
Yeah.
But it was a good conversation, and it was receptive. It was open, and so was Ed. Ed was very, very keen on it, and we did a lot of work with the unions, trying to increase the number of people from underrepresented groups, particularly on class. But we failed, and I think there were five manual workers now left in Parliament. I'm one of them, and all of us of a certain age. So there were 41%, I think it was, in 79 who were from a manual work. Now, I'm not somebody who wants to say, well, manual work is like, something special. Yeah. But those people, the way they speak, the way they look, the way they dress, if the Labour Party there's nobody left who can speak to them, then I think we're knackered. And there's an element of, I don't think it's not quite that bad, but there's a risk. I always think about Blair and people like John Prescott, David Blunkett, John Reid. I mean, put aside that they were on the right of the party, some of them. They did actually know how to speak the ordinary language. And I think, what do you think?
Yeah.
That's about right.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. I mean, I think also as well, I mean, it's not to sort of, put manual or routine or low status work on any kind of pedestal whatsoever. Everybody's got things to offer and insights to offer. It's not that everything about being middle class is great. I think a lot of kids are sort of forced into a very competitive sort of approach to education and things like that, which is not always that healthy for them because of this over obsession with education within the middle class and the massive fear of them ending up in a routine job that no one in the family can feel proud of, but I think if you have struggled, it gives you a fire in your belly, and then when you speak about that struggle to people, they hear that, and they recognize it as their own struggle, and it's just essential. And without that ingredient, I agree with you, I think we're knackered. And like when you talk about this, so one of the very common things that comes back is, but Tony Benn, but Jeremy Corbyn, they weren't working class, but they're fantastic socialists. And yes, that's true. And yes, that's valid. But 3%, 3%, we need to be doing better than we are.
I agree. I completely, it's been one of the main messages of my political life, to be honest. And I can't say I succeeded, but we did have a tour of the country with No Holding Back, which I was one of the co-founders on. And we asked a lot about class. And the vast majority of people who came onto our calls categorised themselves as working class, Labour Party members or trade unionists, and said that there is a problem, which doesn't mean we're rejecting, and I said this to Gordon in that conversation, we're not rejecting some of our MPs at all. But what I did say to him is, he says, you're trying to stop clever people coming into Parliament from Oxford. I said, no, but they're trying to stop us from people like us. As I said, And that, I think, there is an element of that. But I know that people can get offended.
Yeah,
It's got to
they
be
can.
done in an organic way. But don't tell me that there are most brilliant women or guys all over the country in difficult circumstances
Yeah,
who wouldn't, like, not change makers in their street, their community,
yeah,
their area, their town. And
absolutely. And
that's what I think. I'm passionate about it.
yeah, I mean, I think the conversation about Brexit is a mixed one, isn't it? That's a whole complex, massive thing that you could take a different angles on. But I do feel like the statistics, I think, show it wasn't just in 2019 a case of working class people shifting over to the Tories and voting Tory.
Oh,
There was an awful lot of working class people that supported us in 2017 that just decided to stay home because they'd had enough. So it didn't motivate them necessarily to go and vote Tory, but they didn't feel motivated enough to come out and vote for us.
yeah.
And I just think we have to look at that and what's happened to working class direct representation within the public face of the party, and also our direct voice in terms of policy as well.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that there is that.
I think there are cultural and life experience differences.
Yeah.
Which we've got to be sensitive to. Actually, what Gramsci partly talked about was the organic intellectual.
Yes.
I know he talked about working class intellectual, but he had a lot about the modern prince or the organic intellectual. And what that was a political party.
Yeah.
And the idea was that it wasn't simply about individuals, it's about the party as a whole.
Yes.
And the idea that it should link to the life experiences of all the people it wants to represent.
Yeah.
And give expression to that, and then build a counter hegemony, as they called it. Now, I don't think you can easily do that if you decide, well, it don't really matter if you're a professional lawyer or a bricklayer, because you're both working people working for a living and working for a wage. You're a wage slave. Of course, in Marx, that is true, and I don't dissent from the view that if you're selling your labor and somebody else is making profit from it, it's an exploitative relationship. However, to suggest that there's no difference in the life experiences of somebody who went to a posh public school, did a law degree, ended up as a barrister, and somebody who got kicked out of school at 16 or whatever, ended up as an unskilled laboring job in a warehouse.
Yeah.
It's balmy.
It is.
And that argument has got to be confronted, and so I think, that there's an issue there which we shouldn't. I honestly think that I have met many people who deny that, by the way, in the party. Very few people will say that's not true. And we'll come up with alternative arguments. It's true that
it is.
Some of our leading subjects were from very, very posh backgrounds. But you could say, well, they were class traitors to their own class.
Yeah.
And,
But what I find as well is that if you say that, there's a world of difference and we have to look at these patterns, we can't, so if you're working class and you leave higher education with exactly the same qualification, exactly the same level as someone from a middle class background, they will earn, it's something like 16 or 17% more than you throughout the course of their, working class people generally, they're characterized by a flatline income throughout the whole of their career, whereas middle class incomes steadily rise. We have to look at these patterns, and these are the people, the flatline income people, these are the people that are still the working class. They're in different types of jobs, that they've got less rights now than they ever had, but they're still there. And if you say that, although people on the left who identify as working class, even though they might have middle class privilege, even though they might agree with you when you have that conversation, they'll then shift the argument onto another thing or another thing or another thing. There's an unwillingness to. So, for example, the other day, it was suggested to me that because I was putting forward a motion to conference this year, got knocked back last time because it was to do with organizational. Rather than policy, and I hadn't realized you're not supposed to mix the two things up. So this time I've got an organizational one which looks at the actual rule book and going as a rule change, lots of different rule changes to include class in the same way as far as the Equalities Act will let us, as we do with the other underrepresented groups. And one of the arguments came back was, no, it's not, it's about low income. Call it low income, don't call it working class. And I'm like, well, no, because it's not just about income. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's about these cultural factors as well. You know, discrimination doesn't just happen because people are poorer. It happens because there's prejudice. And so you have to have those two things within that, or we're not recognizing, you know, a big part of the problem. And it's insidious in the same way that with racism and sexism, sometimes some of it is subliminal and it's hard to grasp hold of and evidence it, but it's there, you know, that like 1,000 tiny cuts or microaggressions or whatever you call it. The same thing happens with classism. And I think we have to grapple with that. We have to be prepared to look at that as a party.
Well, you surprise me that was said to you. That does surprise me. I mean, we did it all throughout the whole country. I mean, we met some people who said, well, party members who said, well, I've never met a working class person in my life, so I don't know what they think, but I'd like to know, you know. And we met more people who said that they were working class. Some of them had done well in life, you know, and some of them were doing pretty menial tasks, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it is quite difficult, this. I mean, for example, care workers, clearly it's a working class occupation, but you're not necessarily getting your hands dirty in the way that, say, a miner would or I did on a building site. So, I mean, there's no doubt there's subtle changes in the way it works. But yeah, I mean, you know, the way you talk. I've had people tell me that I don't talk right, you know, that I don't sound like a member of parliament when I talk. I mean, what the problem we've got is, well, what, you know, we're fixing our minds what an MP looks like. It used to be white and male, now it's white and kind of, it's quite often fairly middle class, but we are changing the ethnicity and other aspects of parliament, which is all very, very good. Yeah. But to be told you don't talk right, and I didn't know MPs could talk like that kind of stuff. There's an element of snobbery about it, and you know, there's only one answer to that, which is to confront the snobs.
Yeah.
There's no answer to it. Don't give them an inch. Do not give them an inch.
You can confront the snobs, but if they hold the levers of power, if they get to decide who gets to stand as a candidate, and I think now, you know, candidates, they're not normally people, they're normally salaried people, they're not normally people who come from, you know, a grafting background, if you know what I mean. So
it's an interesting debate, this, but don't give in. That's my advice to you.
Yeah.
And I've never given in. I've never changed who I am. I've tried not to change who I am. You do change this, but
have you ever felt like packing it in? Have you ever felt like packing it in on the class issue? I mean,
no, because it's who I am. You know, every morning when I wake up, I try to remember what it was like when I work in on the building sites in midwinter and it was freezing, and you were bringing a lump hammer into a wall and you were hitting your hand, but you couldn't feel it because it was so cold.
Yeah.
I mean, and you were wearing 2 pairs of jeans and those kind of things. I'll never forget all that kind of stuff. Working on roofs in midwinter and it's icy and on the roof and that kind of stuff. I mean, when I worked in Downing Street, and as you know, and but I tried to remember every time I walked up there, you know, who I was. Yeah. And I'm not going to change, and I don't think you should. But I remember I was 46 when I was elected. As I said, I'd never earned even the average wage. I don't think in my whole life I'd ever earned it. And so that's who I am. But we need, you know, people like you pushing forward the next generation, and don't allow anybody to. That's the other thing, by the way, is another thing that my granddad said is, he says, don't forget where the real elite. I mean, and he was talking to me because we were building houses and I helped to build houses that'll be there 200 years after I've died, which provide a family home, a loving place for people to go and live. He says, where the real elite, people who can, you know, dig coal or whatever it might be, generate electricity, provide houses, you know, care for children and all those kind of things. I don't want it to be purely gendered this. Where the real elite. So people who say that we're not good enough. Yeah. Are actually trying to reinforce their own power structures in society. Yeah. And I think in a quiet, modest, moderate way, I've never sort of flown my weight around in that respect. Just, I'm sorry, that isn't right, mate. You know, you're just wrong on that. And I'm going to stick to my principles. We're going to persuade people that we're right. You know, and anyway, look, why are we getting more and more difficulty in winning majorities in Parliament? It's partly to do with all of those things and ideological things and others. But yeah, it's been a very interesting conversation.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad that you're not inclined to give up at this point. I'm glad you're still feeling motivated.
I'm hungry for change. I mean,
you're exactly what we need in Parliament. Who we need in Parliament. Yeah, definitely. Listen, thank you so much for coming on.
Nice. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for me.
Democracy.